Welcome back, dudes. So today we are going to be talking about the fountain. It was created by Marcel Duchamp. So we're kind of going to go into the history of him, and the history of the museum, history of the exhibit, and kind of the effect that the fountain had on art. Also, he is French. That is a French name. So if I am butchering it, I totally apologize. I am not French. Do not expect me to pronounce it correctly. So, his full name, Henry Robert Marcel Duchamp, which is a freaking long name. So, he was a French-American who practiced Dadaism, although he didn't like being associated with the name because he thought that they were extremists and didn't want to be associated with that group particularly. Cubism and conceptual art. He also did sculpting, writing, and was a great chess player apparently. So, really, a jack of all trades. He lived from July 28th, 1887 to October 2nd, 1968. And he ended up permanently moving to America in 1955. Duchamp is commonly regarded, along with Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse, as one of the three artists who helped define the revolutionary developments in the plastic arts. And in the opening decades, sorry, I can't even read my own notes. And in the opening decades of the 20th century, he was responsible for significant developments in painting and sculpture. So, Duchamp wanted his art to be more than visual. And he actually ended up criticizing his contemporaries for this. He thought that they were too retinal, whatever that means. He wanted them to be more conceptual, and he thought that having art be too visual was hindering what it could be potentially used for. This philosophy and ideology actually ended up impacting a lot of 21st century art and ended up influencing modernism a lot. So basically, history of the museum and history of the exhibit. The exhibit was held at the Grand Central Palace. It was originally two structures in Midtown Manhattan, New York City. The original building was constructed in 1893 and was 6 stories tall. However, that was demolished, and in 1911, the original building was demolished. Again, I can read. And replaced with a 13-story building. In 1917, the Society of Independent Artists, of whom Duchamp was a board member, wanted an inaugural exhibit to celebrate. They created a rule that anyone who paid the fee would have their art accepted, and honestly, I don't see how they thought that this was a good idea, or how they thought this couldn't go wrong. I mean, I guess you get what you pay for. Or they just were greedy and wanted money. I don't know. I wasn't there at the time. Not that old. So, basically, what happened? So there was a rumor spreading around before the inaugural opening that Marcel Duchamp was working on a massive painting in Cubism style called Tulip Hysteria Coordinating. Prior to this, in 1912, he had created another Cubism painting called Nude Descending a Staircase No. 2. And this was his first famous painting. So by 1917, there was a lot of buzz and notability surrounding his name. People were excited about this art piece that theoretically had been working on for years. It was supposed to be magnificent. There's a lot of secrecy around it. Nobody had seen this painting. Nobody was allowed into his studio. Even the other board members wanted to know what this painting looked like and wanted hints about what this painting was about. They got nothing. So, due to the rumor of the mysterious painting and the excitement from his previous success, everyone was Everyone was excited to see what he would admit to the show. Since he was a board member of the society, which added to the pressure of exhibiting something amazing, he kind of knew that there was going to be a lot of press and a lot of audience views on what he would exhibit, so he kind of knew what he was doing. Like, this wasn't an accident, this was wholly intentional. So one time came for him to submit his piece. He actually didn't submit a painting. He ended up submitting a functional urinal signed R. Mutt 1917. And that's it. There was no fancy painting. There was no alterations to the urinal. It wasn't even created from scratch. He simply purchased a urinal, signed it, and he paid the fee, and that was his submission. So per the rules of the exhibit, because he paid the fee, they had to accept it. However, they were so mortified and horrified by what he exhibited, because it was a urinal, that they did not put it on the floor with the other pieces. They actually tucked it away and didn't really want any of the general audiences to see it because they thought it was just so disgusting. However, in 1918, a journalist photographed and wrote an article about the piece. This ended up causing it to become very famous. People ended up wanting to know a lot more about it. They were very intrigued by this piece, obviously. Why would this famous artist create something so unusual? So it kind of went from zero to hero, if you can call it a hero. So the exhibitists were not super happy about this. They wanted it to be ignored. They wanted it to be forgotten, and that was not happening. It was getting a whole lot of attention. And naturally, a lot of people wanted to know why he signed it R. Mutt 1917. So he simply responded with, Mutt comes from Mott Works, the name of a large sanitary equipment manufacturer. But Mott was too close, so I altered it to Mutt. After the daily cartoon strip Mutt and Jeff, which appeared at the time and with which everyone was familiar. Thus, from the start, there was an interplay of Mutt, a fat, little funny man, and Jeff, a tall, thin man. I wanted any old name, and I added Richard, French slang for moneybags. That's not a bad name for a pissorte. Get it? The opposite of poverty. But not even that much. Just R. Mutt. So the interesting thing about this is that he actually never saw it as a failure. Because, initially, there was no fame or notoriety about his piece. So a lot of people might have, especially considering his first artwork, a lot of people might consider it a failure. But when asked about the rejection of his piece, he simply said, no, not rejected. A work can't be rejected by the independents. It was simply suppressed. I was on the jury, but I wasn't consulted, because the officials didn't know that it was I who had sent it in. I had written the name Mutt on it to avoid the connection with the personal. So what happened next? While Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse made immense contributions to modern art, they never pushed art to concepts like Marcel Duchamp did. Pablo Picasso co-founded Cubism and created collaging, and Henri Matisse created a rigor style that flattened shapes and were more patterned. So, due to Duchamp's influence, the idea of art and what it represented entered the conversation and became very important, and ended up helping to impact and create modernism, whereas before it was more purely aesthetic. Think Romanticism and Baroque. That period was mostly focused on proportions and shading and colors and that kind of stuff. The Romanticism period as well was how grand can you make the landscape. It wasn't what does this represent? What was the artist trying to convey? And that's kind of what modernism was kind of going for originally, was the philosophy of the art. So he kind of worked with the other two to, again, revolutionize not just what the art looked like, but also the conversation and how we think about art to this day, actually. Which is all very fascinating. You would think, looking at that urinal, that it wasn't anything important, but it's obviously impacted art history a lot more than a lot of people realize. So, as usual, sources are below, and I hope you learned something new. I guess, have a good day. See you next time.